Hello, and thank you for choosing to join this More Than Maps workshop. The More Than Maps workshop series comprises 5 workshops, which you can work through consecutively, in any other order, or just choose the workshop that you think will benefit you the most and ignore the others. You can do as many or as few as you choose. However, the workshop series as a whole aims to improve your understanding of the types of research skills, practices, frameworks, and methods that we use as researchers to study our changing coasts, and specifically to study coastal adaptation. You can choose from workshops that provide an overview to the research disciplines that we use to research the coast, Workshop 1, to learn how to use Google Earth Engine and JavaScript for environmental mapping, Workshop 2, or how to apply a stakeholder analysis to better understand people who are at the heart of environmental problems and challenges, Workshop 3. Or you can study a case study of Somerset levels and flooding at Somerset levels to better understand how we can use mapping and remote sensing data to study flood risk, Workshop 4. Finally, you can find out about frameworks and methods to study how households can adapt to coastal hazards, Workshop 5. We're extremely grateful for all the different funders, partners, and organisations who've supported this workshop series to date, and you can see these types of organisations on screen now. I hope you enjoy the workshops or workshop that you choose to participate in. Welcome to Workshop 3, How Can Studying People Help Solve Environmental Problems? This workshop was developed by Ms. Marie Schlenker, who is looking forward to sharing her knowledge and expertise on how you can use a stakeholder analysis to study environmental problems. Don't forget to open your workshop booklet to support you in this workshop and enable you to take part in interactive elements. I hope you enjoy Workshop 3. We are always looking to improve the More Than Maps workshops and learn from you how we can make the experience better and improve your learning about coastal change, climate change, and coastal adaptation. Please take 1 minute to complete this survey to help us improve the workshops.
Hi and welcome everyone to More Than Maps. Today's workshop is about stakeholder analysis. Hopefully by the end of today's workshop on stakeholder analysis, you will be able to define what sarcasm is and why it can be both viewed as a threat and an opportunity, define what social science is, and explain why social science is important for adapting to environmental issues. And then you will learn how to apply a commonly used social science research method, the stakeholder analysis, to case studies of environmental issues. Here you can see a quick workshop outline. First, you'll learn about sarcasm and what it is and where it occurs, about social science in general, and then more about our social science research method, the stakeholder analysis, and how we can apply stakeholder analysis to the sarcasm case study. And then we'll have a short outlook about further options to use stakeholder analysis in other contexts, and reflect very briefly on this workshop. So what is sargassum? Sargassum is a brown algae that can form large mats that drift on the top of the ocean, and they're also referred to as golden tides. And you can see what they look like in this picture on the right hand side. This is what the sargassum looks like once it has reached the beach, but usually it's traveling in large mats on the surface of the ocean. But since 2011, we've seen unusually high amounts of sargassum being washed ashore in the Caribbean. And since then, there have been other years with extreme amounts of sargassum being washed on the shore, like in 2015 and 2018. So there are really large volumes of sargassum that have been starting to cause serious social, ecological, and economic concerns for those states in the Caribbean. So the sargassum can be viewed from different perspectives, and today we're going to look at 3 different ones. So the first one is sargassum as an emergent threat to the Caribbean. So it has been found that sargassum can negatively affect existing ecosystems, reduce fish catch, and limit fishing activities. For example, you can imagine it might be quite hard to get out with a fishing boat if there are large mats of sargassum near the beach. So it's been starting to impact livelihoods of fishermen, but it's also having a big impact on tourism. So a lot of the tourists don't want to come if they know they can't swim in the sea. And it's also just unpleasant to live with. So it has a smell that's not great, and obviously doesn't look great as well. So this is what people think about sargassum as an emergent threat. However, there's also another way to view sargassum. So sargassum is also perceived as the rainforest of the sea. It's a naturally occurring algae. It's been there for a very long time. Its origin is in the Sargasso Sea. And it's quite a unique ecosystem. For example, you might have some marine species that like hiding in these floating maps of algae. So it's also called the golden floating rainforest of the sea. So just keep this in mind, that different perspectives of how sargassum might be viewed. And with the arrival of these large mats of sargassum on the beaches in the Caribbean, a third perspective on sargassum has evolved, which is sargassum as a lucrative resource. So people have been starting to think about this algae as an opportunity, for example, with respect to creating new types of organic beauty products, fertilizers, as bricks for houses, lots of different opportunities. So people are trying to see how they might be able to use sargassum. So this is obviously a very different perspective to the emergent threat of sargassum. And this just shows that people perceive this environmental topic from very different perspectives. So now it's time for you to think about which perspective most resonates with you. So take a couple of minutes, maybe pause the recording here for 30 seconds, a minute or two, and just think about how would you view sargassum. I hope you had some time to think about which perspective on sargassum resonates most with you. Right now I'm going to give you a few more information on sargassum as an emergent hazard. So basically, whenever it comes close to the beach, it has negative near and onshore impacts. And that's related to the gases that are released by sargassum, so it creates an unpleasant smell, and it's potentially also a risk to human health. It's threatening fragile ecosystems such as mangroves and seagrass beds. It's a problem for nesting turtles, so if you imagine that the small baby turtles are hatching and then need to find their way to the sea, they might get trapped in the algae. It's also a major threat to tourism because tourists just would like to swim in the sea and use the beach. So if there are these large mats on the beach, people might just go somewhere else. And it's also a threat to the livelihoods of fishing communities by blocking ports and confining boats, affecting the fishing gear and boat engines, and potentially also the number of fish near the shore. So there are already ways that people are adapting to these large amounts of sargassum on the shores. So for example, there are beach cleanups and mass removal of sargassum, whether that's through manual labor or through big machinery on the beach. There are ways that people are protecting their beaches from sargassum by preventing the algae to reach the shore, such as with nets. There are communication plans and awareness campaigns in place to educate the local communities about sargassum. There's tax relief for cleaning equipment and affected properties, and there are also some efforts to forecast when sargassum will reach shores. And at the same time, there are people that have started to exploit sargassum as an opportunity, as an economic opportunity. So for example, through the creation of products such as soaps or skincare, using it as fertilizer for agriculture, or as a substrate for biofuels. So this is the background on sargassum, but now let's have a look at sargassum from a social science perspective. Social science is defined as the study of how people are affected or also influence the world around us. So it's a two-way process. And social scientists can either work desk-based or field-based. They might use quantitative or qualitative data. So quantitative data is any kind of data that kind of refers to numbers, that wants to quantify how people behave or do things, think things. Versus qualitative is more concerned about the why, reasons behind why people behave in a certain way, and it doesn't necessarily come with any quantifiable aspect to it. So that's just very general. Now let's have a look at what social science methods might actually lead to quantitative and qualitative data. So how do you think you could use social science to collect quantitative data? And the same goes for how could you collect qualitative data. Again, quantitative data is concerned with numbers. For example, you want to be able to say that 50% of the population are unhappy with sargassum on their beach. That's just an example. And then the qualitative data would be people are unhappy because of a variety of different reasons that they talk to you about or let you know somehow, but it's not actually having a number with it. So again, take a few minutes. Ideally, you would stop the recording here and just think about which data collection options would there be for quantitative and qualitative data. So I hope you had some time to think about quantitative and qualitative data collection methods. So quantitative data collection methods, really common ones, are, for example, surveys and questionnaires that give you an indication of how many respondents think about sargassum in a certain way. For example, you have pre-identified categories or closed questions which allow you to then say, okay, let's say 50% of our respondents agreed that sargassum should be perceived as an emergent threat. That's just an example. And typical methods to collect qualitative data would be things like in-depth interviews, focus group discussions, participatory approaches such as participatory mapping or transect walks, things that allow you to understand a little bit more about the why. Why do people perceive it as an emergent threat? And this is not necessarily quantified, but is valuable data on its own, just because it gives you connections and reasoning behind the quantitative data. So let's come out to our social science research methods for today, which is the stakeholder analysis. So stakeholder analysis is a tool for generating knowledge about different actors that are somehow involved in a topic. So this could be useful for policy, for management options, or for project implementation. And in general, a stakeholder is anyone who can affect or is affected by an organization, a strategy, a project, or an issue. So in our case, for example, the issue of sargassum arriving in large volumes on the Caribbean coast. And our stakeholder could be an individual, like one person, a group, organization. So for example, in the case of stakeholders in the sargassum case study, we could think about a single fisherman who is affected because he can't go out with his boat, a group of locals that have come together to do a cleanup on the beach, for example, or an entire organization that will work on this issue, whether that's an NGO or it could even be the government. So stakeholders come in various different forms. And with the stakeholder analysis, we always identify stakeholders' interests and their influence. So we are interested to know what they want and how powerful they are. So before you're starting your stakeholder analysis, you will need to do some preliminary considerations. And basically that has to do with the aim of your stakeholder analysis. What do you want to achieve with this approach? Do you want to implement a project? Are you working on a new policy? What do you want to use this for? Because this aim comes with different ways to approach your stakeholder analysis. For example, the time dimension. Are you looking at just classifying what the status quo is, or are you interested in what a future might look like? Are you looking into a local area only and you want to try to implement something in a local community, or are you looking nationwide? So all these things kind of come into play. The context is really important for your stakeholder analysis. So if you already have in mind that you want to use stakeholder analysis, now is a good moment to just stop the recording again and just think about what you could do to, kind of find the context for your stakeholder analysis. Just a few thoughts on what is your aim in actually conducting a stakeholder analysis. Let's take a closer look at the time dimensions involved in the stakeholder analysis. So on the x-axis here, you see the time, past, present, and future. And the y-axis has lots of different dimensions. So it has the purpose, the focus, the interest, scope of the analysis, time frame, and stage. So let's say you want to implement a policy. So that kind of puts you into the present and near future with respect to your stakeholder analysis. And what that means is that it comes with a different way of looking at your stakeholder analysis. So you have a forward-looking focus. Your interest will mainly be to achieve your objective in actually implementing this policy. And because of the way that you are looking at your implementation, you have quite a narrow focus because you really want to deal with the present and near future, and you are interested in making this project work. So you are interested in who's directly involved in it, for example, and you might be on a relatively short time frame for conducting your stakeholder analysis, so you're kind of limited in these time constraints as well, and you're kind of in the pre-implementation and planning phase here. So a different approach would be to look at policy development, which obviously is more concerned about the future and what this policy might do in the future. So directly you're getting a different type of scope, so your scope will be broader because the future isn't set in stone yet, and you need to research who might be affected by the policy that you're planning to develop. So you're more concerned about medium term and forward-looking analysis. So this kind of has a big impact on what you're looking in terms of how broad your analysis will be and which stakeholders you might include in it. So when you're actually conducting your stakeholder analysis, you always have to have your aim in mind. And you will need to have data about your stakeholders, whether that's primary or secondary data. And that's kind of what will give you the information to actually conduct an analysis of the different people and actors involved. And you will need options to organize and analyze your data, to present it, and also you would also want to know already what might be options for using the data eventually. So let's have a closer look at the data collection options. So stakeholders might be people or organizations that are involved in the issue, have an interest in the issue at hand, might have particular influence or power or an important position, or that might be impacted by the issue. And in this case, this would be our sarcasm case study. So for example, primary data could be collected via interviews with locals, with cleaning companies, with the government, council, lots of different actors. It could be questionnaires, it could be focus group discussions, but on the other hand, there might already be data that is already collected. So yeah, there might be secondary data like published and unpublished documents, reports that have been written previously, policy statements, or internal regulations. So in general, you want to start very broad and then become more focused as you continue your stakeholder analysis. So this slide gives you some options for organizing and presenting your data that you will collect as part of your stakeholder analysis. So an easy way to present your data is a table with your stakeholder, their interests, and their influence. Obviously filled in with the information that you found out about them. But you could also take a different approach. So you could have a matrix, or you could have a word cloud or a mind map approach, like we can see it here on the slide. So you might want to group your stakeholders depending on their position, for example, with respect to a certain issue, or categorizing them in organizations or individuals, things like that. It helps you to categorize your stakeholders. And another approach might be this circle diagram on the right hand side, where potentially you would have the most important stakeholders that are at the heart of the issue in the middle of the circle diagram, and then you would have other stakeholders that are directly involved, and then you might have indirectly involved stakeholders on the outside, kind of giving a presentation to the visualization to the data and to the importance of your different stakeholders. So these are just a couple of options, a lot more, but you kind of want to plan your stakeholder analysis with these already in mind. So let's take a look at stakeholder analysis for a case study, the large amounts of sargassum that have been reaching the beaches in the Caribbean. On the left-hand side, you see a boat and a person, and they might be a fisherman, and they might be an important stakeholder in the sargassum case study, because they might be affected by the large amounts of sargassum arriving on the beach. In the middle you see a turtle, and you might recall from the introduction, turtles actually lay eggs on the beach, and the little turtles hatch on the beach and then make their way into the water. So this sargassum could potentially be dangerous for the little baby turtles in reaching the sea. And then on the right hand side, you're seeing people kind of removing the sargassum with shovels. So this might be a local community, it might be an organized cleanup, for example. So again, the locals might be an important stakeholder in this sargassum case study, because they are affected by these large amounts of beaches in their local environment. So this slide shows a range of stakeholders involved in the sargassum case study. So let's have a look at picture number 1, for example. You see that the sargassum is being collected from the beach, and who might be stakeholders that are involved with this? So this might be the cleaning company that has been hired to clean the beach. It might be the employees of the cleaning company that, are dependent on their jobs. Indirectly, it might even be the local shops and the local tourism facilities that profit from this being removed from the beach, or the local community that's living close by. So you can see just from this one image, there are a range of stakeholders that might be potentially involved in this. And now you will have some time to identify stakeholders yourself, and I'm going to show you on the next slide how this will work. So if you head to your workshop booklet, there should be a link next to this video on the website where you can access the workshop booklet, and try to find this table that looks similar to what you can see here on the slide, that has stakeholders, their interest and influence in the different columns. So you would identify a stakeholder, let's say the cleaning company. You would identify the interest, which would be to make a profit from removing the sargassum on the beach, and the influence. So this is obviously dependent on data that you currently don't have, but just from a assumption, let's say they have like medium influence. So it's a company that employs quite a few people. So they might have, some influence within the local community when it comes to like lobbying and things like that. But they're also not like, say, the national government. Or an individual person. So something like medium influence could, for example, be what you write down in the influence column here. So now you can take around 10 minutes to fill in this form, this table, using the images that you've seen on the previous slides. And in a second I will move back to the images so you can actually see them. So here you can see the different images again. Again, take up to 10 minutes to fill in the table in your workshop booklet, and just pause the recording for now. See you in a bit. So before we come back to some of the stakeholders in the sargassum case study, I just want to point out that stakeholders can be categorized. So for example, in our case study, we could categorize stakeholders according to their interest with regards to sargassum. So let's say there's a stakeholder category that is responding to sargassum influxes as a hazard requiring management, mitigation, or adaptation. There might be stakeholders that are responding to sargassum as a resource, commodity, or opportunity. And there might be a third group of stakeholders that have broad interest in sargassum, both in terms of hazard management, but also as a potential opportunity. So thank you for identifying all the different stakeholders. For our example now, we're going to look at 4 different stakeholders in more detail. So first, we will have the national government. So in general, they want to support economic growth in the country from key sectors such as tourism and fishing. They also need to adhere to the international conservation targets, and they're acting on limited funds. And in general, we are going to assume that they have a high influence. Then we have the local conservation groups that might have mixed interests. So sargassum can harm some marine life, such as turtles, as we've heard before, but also clearing the sargassum from the beach with big machinery could be very environmentally damaging. And in general, we're going to assume that this is a relatively small group with low influence. Then we have the local fishers who would like the sargassum to be cleared in some areas so that they can actually access the harbors and fishing grounds and safely maneuver out with their boats and catch the species that they're interested in. And again, we're going to assume that they have relatively low influence. And then the last stakeholder is going to be our hotel owner, who would like all the sargassum to be cleared so that the tourists can actually swim and use the beach and obviously take some nice Instagram photos, right? And we're going to assume that this hotel owner actually owns an entire chain, is quite good at lobbying, and therefore also has high influence. So now, considering all these four stakeholders, which categories do you think they might belong in? Just pause the recording here for a couple of seconds and think about this. So there are different answers to the categorization question, but the most common would be to say that the government has an interest in sargassum both as a hazard and as an opportunity, while the local fisheries and conservation groups will see the large influxes of sargassum mainly as a hazard. Same with the hotel owner, actually. But they're obviously varying degrees to this. So there might be, a local fisher that might also decide to, think about other ways to make money and will use the sargassum for other purposes, for example. In that case, the local fishers would also be interested in sargassum as an opportunity. So this really depends on the existing data that you have for your case study. So now let's have a look at a stakeholder matrix, which is the main key to a stakeholder analysis. So on the x-axis of the stakeholder matrix, we got the influence from low to high of a specific stakeholder. And on the y-axis, we got the interest, again, from low to high. So this kind of divides the space in the graph into four different rectangles. So we got a square down here with low interest and low influence, and if we go follow up on the y-axis, we're going to have a higher interest but still a low influence. If we go to the right, we get high interest and high influence, and then if we go down again, we will decrease the interest, so we get to low interest but still a high influence. So these are the four squares that we have. So in a stakeholder analysis, it might be useful to identify so-called victims and decision makers. So victims are people and stakeholders in the group that have a very high interest in what happens, let's say to the sargassum, but have a very low influence in actually, having a say in what will happen. Versus the decision makers, they have a high interest, but they also have a very high influence. So these are very two interesting groups of stakeholders. So again, we got our next interactive exercise. Where do you think the stakeholders fit on the matrix? So now our squares got numbers from 1 to 4. And I would like you to use a couple of minutes to put these different stakeholders into the squares in your mind. So again, just stop the recording for a couple of seconds and I'll be back with the official solution. So here you can see the solution to the task that we just gave you. This is just one solution, and this obviously depends on the data that we have, or in our case, the assumptions that we used. So we came in with the assumption that the government has a very high influence, so that directly puts them into one of the two squares on the right. We've been thinking that the government has a very high interest in what happens to sargassum due to their interest in the fishing and the tourism as big economic sectors of these island states in the Caribbean. We also put the hotel owner in the same category because, again, as you remember, the hotel owner in our case study had a very high interest and influence as well. And then the fishing groups and conservation groups, we came in with the assumption that they have low influence, which puts them in the left square. But again, because their livelihood depends on it, and because the ecosystems are threatened by sargassum, these groups still have a high interest in sargassum, which puts them at the top of the graph. I hope this all makes sense. So let's have a look at how we can manage sargassum, and we'll look at two different types of policies here, with policy 0 just being leaving the sargassum where it is and doing absolutely nothing and letting stakeholders cope with the impacts of that. And then policy 1 is that we actually start managing the sargassum by using a participatory approach, so bringing in all stakeholders on the table and make sure that everyone who's affected has a say in what happens to the sargassum. So let's have a look at what that does to our stakeholder matrix. So policy 0 was basically our status quo, so we do nothing to manage the sargassum, which is what we've seen before with the fishing groups and the conservation groups named as victims and the government and the hotel owners as decision makers. However, what will happen if we would now apply a participatory approach? Maybe take a few minutes or seconds to think about that. Pause the recording here, and when you're ready, press start again so we can have a look at what that does to the stakeholder matrix. Okay, I hope you had some time to look at the stakeholder matrix and to think about how it might change if we apply policy 1 to our matrix now. So because it's a participatory approach, and because that means that everyone gets a say in the matter, we now move the fishing groups and the conservation groups from their square of having high interest but very low influence into the same square as the government and the hotel owner, because we give them power in the decision-making process. So they're now also decision makers. Well done, you made it through the first part of the workshop. This is a great time for a 5-minute break. Just pause the recording and come back to it when you're ready. We will have a look at more sargassum stakeholders now, and for that we will watch a YouTube video, and you will find the link for that in both the workshop booklet and in the instructions next to this video. Make sure that you have somewhere to take notes so that you can write down stakeholders and their interests, for example in the table in the workshop booklet, so that we can have a look at these different stakeholders after you've watched the video. This is what the video should look like. Please make sure that you have the correct video showing up, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes. Hopefully you enjoyed that video. Let's have a look at our stakeholder matrix again, looking at the sargassum. And before we used the simple matrix with the 4 different squares, and we kind of mapped the stakeholders onto the matrix. Let's have a look at a slightly different version of that now. So let's have another look at a slightly different version of the stakeholder matrix. As you can see, all the 4 squares that we had before are gone, and this allows us to actually indicate nuances in the interest and the influence of the stakeholders a little bit more. So basically what we can now do is we can indicate where stakeholders fit onto the matrix with little crosses, and the fact that it's an open diagram allows us to show differences in their influences and interests a little bit more rather than just having 2 boxes. So take a little bit of time now to think about the stakeholders that you've just identified in the video, and please plot them on the matrix where you think they might belong. There should be something in the booklet that will help you do this, but you're also welcome to just use a piece of paper and think about where your stakeholders fit onto this matrix. So hopefully you had a little play with the stakeholder matrix by mapping the stakeholders that you've just identified in the YouTube video onto the matrix. There's no ideal solution. The reason being that we just don't have enough information from the short video about all the stakeholders that you might have identified. So this was really an exercise to make you think about stakeholder analysis a little bit more and realize how complicated this analysis might get, and that you do need more information to plot stakeholders into the, onto the correct place. So let's have a look at a more constrained example. You might remember those 4 stakeholders that we had in the first case study: the national government, the local conservation groups, local fishers, and the hotel owner. And we'll now add 2 more stakeholders into the equation. An American biogas company who would like to collect the sargassum to use it as biogas feedstock using the gas in plants in America. And we'll assume that this is quite an influential big company, so it will have high influence. And then we'll look at local businesses, which potentially could identify solutions to use sargassum locally and sustainably, but they have limited funds for research and innovation, and also quite low influence. So let's have a look at what that does to our box model stakeholder matrix. So what you can see here is the stakeholder matrix for a second case study. We still got the fishing groups, the conservation groups, the government, and the hotel, but we've now also added local businesses and an American biogas company. And because they're currently not using the sargassum, we plotted them as having a relatively low interest in the matter right now, because at present they can't really use the sargassum. And then we had the prior assumptions that the local businesses were low in influence and the American biogas company high influence. So that's how we get to this diagram. And now we can take another look at sargassum management. So we already discussed policy 0 and policy 1. And now we'll look at 2 different policies and compare them by using a stakeholder analysis. So policy 2 is to provide licenses for the International Biogas Company to collect and export the sargassum for biogas production. And policy 3 is to provide grants for local businesses to identify locally relevant solutions to use the sargassum, for example as fertilizers, within the Caribbean. So what does that do to our stakeholder matrix? I would like you to take some time to think about how policy 2 and policy 3 might result in different variations of the stakeholder matrix. So please take a couple of minutes and have a think about where you would plot, especially the local businesses and the American biogas company, onto the stakeholder diagram under the following policies. And this is the solution to it. So in the case of providing the licenses for the International Biogas Company, we suddenly move the American Biogas Company into the high interest square. The reason being that they now actually can use the sargassum, and it's an economically viable and relevant choice for them. So they're suddenly very interested in the sargassum, which moves them up 1 square while their influence stays constant. How about policy 3 with the grants for the local businesses? So as you can see here, we've moved both the local businesses but also the fishing and conservation groups into the decision-making square. So what's the reason for this? So the local businesses obviously become a lot more interested in the sargassum issue and how they might use it if they are provided with small grants. The smaller grants are not just open to local businesses, but they could also be used by the fishing groups and the conservation groups as well, who could apply for them. And at the same time, there might be cooperation between the businesses and the fishing groups and the conservation groups. And because this is a local solution, all these local people suddenly become decision makers and can decide what they would like to do with the sarcasm. So that's why all three of them move over to the high influence, high interest square. Well done for completing the sarcasm case study. Let's take this moment and have a look at in what other environmental issues or projects you could use a stakeholder analysis, maybe even for your own work or research. And just take a couple of minutes and write down some ideas that you might have for using a stakeholder analysis and stakeholder matrix. Hopefully you've had some ideas on how to use stakeholder analysis in your own work and research. Let's have a look at a few take-home messages from today. Social science is useful for showing how people are affected by a phenomenon, for example, sarcasm, and how they can influence it, for example, through policy making. Social sciences can also be used to inform equitable environmental decision making, as we've seen it through the participatory approach. And stakeholder analysis is really just one research method used in social sciences to inform decision making. Take a few minutes and think about what your personal take-home message is from today. We'd love to hear about it. Thank you from me, and there's just a couple more things to finish before we close this video. Thank you.
You have now completed your More Than Maths workshop. Before you go, please could I ask you to take 1 to 2 minutes to complete the survey and leave us feedback on how you found the workshop and your workshop experience. This will enable us to continue to improve the workshops for future workshop participants. Thank you for choosing a More Than Maths workshop. Well done, you completed your workshop. Don't forget, this workshop is part of a 5-part workshop series. Now, obviously you've completed 1 or more workshops already, but don't forget there are other workshops you can choose from too that will increase your skills and understanding of how researchers study the coasts and especially our changing coasts. So feel free to sign up for another workshop to learn more about how we can study climate change in the context of the coast.